Millions of Americans suffer from an intolerance to something that is literally found in most commonly consumed foods. We're talking about gluten and those who suffer from celiac disease, an intolerance to gluten. Well, we're joined by a family committed to improving food labels to better protect fellow celiacs. We're joined by Jon Bari, president of Celiac Journey, Leslie Bari, founder of Gluten Free Finds, and Jax, their 9-year-old son who suffers from celiac disease. I want to thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having us today.
Thank you so much.
So let's just define, if we can, celiac disease.
Sure, it's an autoimmune disease that affects 3 million Americans at least, and 52,000 South Carolinians. And for someone with celiac disease, it's having a food allergy to gluten. And what's gluten? Well, it's found in wheat, barley, rye, and most oats.
So you were somewhat unprepared for what you ended up discovering with your son Jax. So he was diagnosed in 2018, but what was the first sign that he had this?
So Jax actually didn't have the typical stomach symptoms that you might think of. There are actually about over 200 symptoms for celiac disease, and Jax was not growing. He had kind of fallen off the growth chart. He was small, he hadn't been growing at the normal rate. And so he was not growing, and he was also anemic as well. He had very low iron, and so those were the symptoms that he had.
Oh, goodness.
And what that is, Layla, is that the body attacks itself in the presence of gluten and does damage to the small intestine, leading to malabsorption, malnutrition, and anemia in his case.
Now, Jax, this question is for you. When you eat something, now I would imagine that you're very cautious. So what's the process before you put something in your mouth?
Well, first at the supermarket, we always, if it's a new thing, we always look to see if it says gluten-free. If not, there are a couple scanner apps that you can scan a barcode and it will say gluten-free, not gluten-free, no gluten-containing ingredients, which means it could have cross-contamination.
It's a real burden and a challenge because gluten is not labeled in packaged goods or packaged foods in the United States, and it is labeled in 62 other countries around the world.
So we're a little bit behind on that. And your whole mission is to eat without fear. So when you talk about legislation when it comes to food labels and things like that, you've really done your homework and your legwork, and you've reached out to our lawmakers, both locally, federally. So what has been the response thus far?
Well, right now we have the Food Labeling Modernization Act that's been introduced and co-sponsored by 4 U.S. senators. But there are a whole host of provisions in that in addition to labeling gluten. What we've been told in terms of practicality is that we need a standalone gluten labeling law like the FASTER Act of 2021. Senator Tim Scott was really, really important in pushing the FASTER Act to label sesame for 1.6 million Americans. And that's a bipartisan blueprint of what we're looking to do this year with the FASTER Act of 2022. And we're hoping that Senator Scott and others introduce this standalone gluten labeling legislation.
That's wonderful. So we could see in the future, maybe not too distant future, a change to all of that can help fellow celiacs. And quite frankly, you know, overeating wheat and some of these other things, having that in your diet is not necessarily a good thing. So what you're doing is great for everybody who consumes food in this country.
Well, I mean, there are 3 million Americans with celiac, but there are 20 million who suffer from non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and then also those who choose to be gluten-free in addition. So this would help 23 million Americans that have some biological reaction to gluten, and I think that it's something that's critical.
Sure.
Because right now there's this uncertainty, and Jax had an issue last summer, unfortunately.
I'm so sorry to hear that, but I want to thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Best of luck. We'll be right back.